Good morning, students. Welcome back to the last section, the last presentation in section 1 of chapter 22, South Asia. Today we're going to talk about the environmental concerns that the countries in the region face, and we're going to start out with population density. The chart there on the left shows the every 10 years census for the country of India, and you can see that in the last 100 years, their population has increased exponentially. This is also true of several of the other smaller countries in South Asia. Part of it is cultural, and part of it is simply happenstance. The cultural part of it is years and years ago, infant mortality rate was very, very high. This meant that a lot of children did not make it to adulthood, passing away from lack of medical care, various diseases, poor standards of living, etc. And families got used to having many children in the hopes that some of them would survive to adulthood. In the culture of South Asia, it's traditional for the children to care for the parents well into their old age, and you will sometimes find families with 3 or even 4 generations living together in the same facility. So high birth rate has always been an issue in that part of the world, and as their lifestyles and technology and medical science have all improved, more and more children, of course, survive into adulthood, and that has caused the population rate to essentially skyrocket just in the last 40 or 50 years. So currently, South Asia accounts for only 3% of the land in the world. It's the Indian subcontinent is actually very, very small when compared to many other areas of the world, but they host 20% of the world's population. So out of somewhere between 7 and 7.5 billion people, 20%, or about 1.5 billion people, live in one of the many countries in South Asia, with about a billion, maybe 1.2 billion, living just in the country of India. So with that population growing, that's actually what causes some of the environmental concerns that we've got going on. As the population grows, there's obviously requirements to sustain that population that grow as well. And that includes an increase for the need for transportation, an increase in the need for food production, an increase in the need for drinkable water, and so on and so forth. And so as that population grows, the biggest effect that we see right here on the slide is the increase in demand for food. So as we'll see on the next couple of slides, that increase in demand for food leads to several things. One is the greater production of animals for meat. Means that herds, domestic herds, are growing larger and larger, and most of these herds feed on the limited grassland that's available in that part of the world. And as such, we have what we call overgrazing, which is where the grasslands get eaten by the animals faster than the plants can actually regenerate. We also have what's called over-farming, which we've talked about in other regions of the world, where soil is farmed so much that the nutrients are completely leached out of it, which leads to the need to, of course, fertilize the soil quite heavily, which we'll talk about later as well. But it also leads to the need for more and more farmland even as crop yields will increase. Crop yield is the amount of crop per acre of land that will actually grow. Crop yields have been improving, but crop yields can only get so high before you actually have to reach out and start acquiring more and more farmland. So we will talk about deforestation on a later slide as well. And last but not least is the increase for food leads to excessive water usage. And as you recall from an earlier lesson, the bulk of the subcontinent is a fairly dry climate, and therefore um, fresh water can come at a premium. And you see where population densities are at their highest around the few rivers that flow through the region, and particularly the larger rivers such as the three that we've talked about in earlier slides. So population density is going to affect each of the other factors that we look at here. And let's talk about water scarcity for a minute. If you look at the chart over there on the left, you can see that the purple color down at the bottom of the scale right here, the purple color is 0 to 30 centimeters of rain per year. Now there's 2.5 centimeters to an inch. So 30 centimeters is about 6 inches worth of rain. And you can see how much of the map over here on the left is encased in the purple, getting less than 6 inches of rain in a year. By contrast, living here in Western Pennsylvania, we will get more than 6 inches of rain in a given month. And you have whole areas of South Asia that are dry. And even going up into the purple and the blue and the blue-green areas here, which as you can see encompass almost the entire subcontinent. At 90 centimeters, that's only 18 inches of rain per year. And again, we've got some months in Western Pennsylvania where we will get that much in just a 30-day period. And when you look up at the highest number of highest amount of rainfall, right here at 240 centimeters is about 10 inches. No, it's about 100 inches. About 240 centimeters here is about 100 inches. That's say 12, 24, 36, 48, 60. That's about 7 or 8 feet of rain, and on up into the highest rainfall, which you see in these very, very small red and yellow dots around the edge of the Himalayas. Now, if you figure that this big red dot right here in the center of the Himalaya mountain range, that's Mount Everest. Even though it's getting 270 to 330 centimeters of precipitation every year, what do you think the odds are that that's in a form that is not usable by farmers? It's probably because it's in the Himalayan mountains at high altitudes. It's likely that these higher rainfalls shown here are actually snowfall. We do see some higher rainfalls along the coast of the Indian Ocean and over here in the Arab Gulf of Arabia. With the prevailing winds moving from west to east, obviously the winds will pick up moisture over these bodies of water and carry it in. But you do have the Western Ghat mountains that cause most of that rainfall to occur on the coast, as well over here with the trailing edge of the Himalayan ranges and the northern highlands. You also have most of the rainfall here falling right along the coastal areas. So incredibly dry climate. Then you start looking at India being what's called, what used to be called India, sorry. India is what used to be called a second world nation or a developing country. It's not heavily industrialized, although industry is much greater now than it was in decades in the past. But the overall region of South Asia, many of these countries would be what we used to call third world countries. And in the whole first world, second world, third world model, the first world countries, the industrialized nations like the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Russia, so on and so forth. A lot of these countries, you've probably heard the phrase, if you follow social media at all, first world problems. We have a first world problem going on right now where people keep buying up all the toilet paper in the grocery stores because of the epidemic that's going on. The second world is the developing nations. These are countries that are taking advantage of some of their natural resources, that are building their industry, that are attempting to grow their economies and become as self-sufficient as possible. And India kind of fits that model. But the rest of the region, the third world, the undeveloped countries, these are countries that are still relying extremely heavily on things like agriculture, fishing industries, um, tourism, things like that to bring money into the country. They don't have big mining industries. They don't have big industrial centers. And the bulk of the population is actually well below the poverty level. And because this region is so far from being fully developed industrially, a lot of the means by which water is brought to the public are either very, very old and in disrepair. For instance, if you look along the Ganges River, which flows in this part of India here, several of the major cities that are along that river, New Delhi, the capital, places like that, the pipes actually date back to when India was part of uh, the British Empire. So some of these pipes are 50, 60, 100 years old and are not carefully maintained enough. So as they start to break down, there's an awful lot of leakage and an awful lot of waste in the water that is being piped around. But in addition to that, since most of the area relies on farming in order to supply the food for the region, um, farmers in a very arid climate really need to irrigate in order to be able to make farming work. And a lot of the irrigation methods that they're using are, again, methods that date back centuries and are not necessarily the most efficient ways of getting um, uh, fresh water from the rivers and streams or from the wells out to the fields. So a lot of the fresh water is actually lost along the way before it ever even gets out to the farms. Now, in a lot of these areas in the lowlands, you will find that the uh, cities that are actually um, drilling for water are able to tap into the underground aquifers and pull water up that way. And if you remember, an aquifer is nothing more than the path by which groundwater travels from one place to the other. So they tap into these aquifers and they're able to pull some fresh water up through those. But because of the way the terrain lays here, I mean, you're on a peninsula, so you've got seawater all around you, is as they pull the fresh water out of the aquifer, because this area is so dry, that water is not refreshed by rainfall as much as it's refreshed from groundwater seeping in from the ocean. So as seawater starts seeping into the aquifer, even though a lot of the salt will get filtered out by the ground, there's still enough salt tainting that seawater that's flowing into the aquifers that they can only pull out so much fresh water before they just have to stop and wait for the aquifers to repopulate with fresh water. The book talks about the city of Dhaka in Bangladesh and the city of Karachi in Pakistan. Both of those cities are up in this area. And they both have an extreme problem with seawater leaching into their aquifers through this through this coastal area here. Now, you would think with a scarcity of fresh water that the folks living there would take care to preserve what little water they would. They do have. But the Ganges River, the longest river in the subcontinent, is actually the single most polluted river on Earth. You can see a photo there that is actually a river bank along the Ganges, and that colorful stuff that you see littered about there is literally trash that is floated down the river. And when the river swells during the rainy season, it carries the trash up onto the riverbanks. And then as the water level goes down, that trash is left behind. All of the garbage that you see here was at one time floating in the river. But that's not the only thing. Litter is not the only problem. What few factories you do have are situated along the Ganges or along other major rivers because you use water in factory production. And what they do is they take the water in, they'll use it for whatever purpose they have in the factory, and then without any kind of filtration process or any kind of treatment process, they just dump it back into the river a little farther downstream. So there's a great deal of factory waste that gets dumped into these rivers, which can include chemicals, can include certain poisonous materials that are used in the industrial process. It can include oil, grease, gasoline, waste materials from the burning of coal or wood, so on and so forth. The other thing that we see in the major rivers around the subcontinent is raw sewage. Unlike in Pennsylvania here, we actually have sewage treatment plants. So when you run your washing machine or your dishwasher, flush your toilet or use the sink or the shower, that water is carried through a sewer system to a sewage treatment plant where all of the bad stuff is extracted from the water. The water is treated to kill off any bacteria, and then it is filtered before being put back into the water supply, either directly into nature or recycled back through a plumbing system. In many parts of India and the other countries in the Indian subcontinent, those sewage treatment plants don't exist. And what you have is any water that is going down the drain is flowing directly from the plumbing system into the river itself. So you flush your toilet, it goes into the river. You take a shower, it goes into the river. You wash your clothes or your dishes, it goes into the river. It just, the amount of raw sewage, bacteria, and again, hazardous waste that gets back into that water supply makes it very, very difficult for the water in those major rivers to be of use. Now, in addition to that, I said we were going to talk a little bit about farmers and the problems they face with soil depletion. Is as the need for farm products increases, farmers are trying to increase their crop yields, the number of crops that they get per acre of land. And they have to farm the land every year. So they can't let a field lie fallow for a year and regenerate nutrients. So what they do instead is they will use artificial fertilizers on the land in order to try to increase the amount of crops that they generate out of that same land. And there's two types of artificial fertilizer that they use. The first one is the nitrate fertilizers, the chemical fertilizers. And we've talked about these before. If you remember, when nitrates are put into the farming soil, um, as the crops are irrigated or as rain falls on them, the nitrates will leach down into the soil, and some of them are going to get carried away with the groundwater and deposit into rivers and streams. Now, the high percentage of nitrate in the water will actually cause algae to grow very, very quickly. The algae will then use up most of the oxygen in the water, and you wind up with fish kills. But you also wind up with water that is can be largely undrinkable. Because if you recall, water is 1/3 oxygen. So the nitrates are a problem here, just like everywhere else. But another problem is that because the subcontinent is heavily agricultural and because it is heavily rural, a lot of the family farms that are out there can't afford the commercial fertilizers. So they use the next best thing. They use the manure from the animals that they're raising on the farm. So you graze the animals uh, leave their waste material around. Your farmers will actually go collect up that waste, and they will mix it with straw or sawdust or some other material, um, and dry it out, grind it up, and go spread it back on the fields. Now, the problem with manure is not only is it still relatively high in nitrates, but it's also carrying any bacteria that may have been inside the intestines of the animal that produced the manure. So, and quite frankly, there are a number of farms throughout the subcontinent that will even use human waste materials for fertilizer. And the bacteria from all of that waste product can actually be carried into the food, the vegetables that are grown, um, if they are not treated properly before they go to market. Farming is also one of the principal causes of deforestation, as the need for more and more food rises. The need for more and more land to produce the food also rises. So there are not that many forests in South Asia to begin with. You have the Himalayan mountains, you have the northern highlands, the northern plains, you have the western and eastern Khat mountains. You have a couple of fairly dry plateaus that really don't support a lot of forest. So the fact that what little forests they do have is being cleared can be a problem. And they clear it to get more farmland, but they also clear it because this is not an industrialized region. This is a region where not every home has electricity or natural gas or propane to run their uh, to run lights, to cook with, to heat the home, to heat the water, etc. So with 1.5 billion people living in the region, and most of them being poor rural uh, population, they will actually go out and they will cut down massive numbers of trees in order to get wood uh, to heat their homes and to cook their food. Once they've cleared the land, then they don't necessarily plant new trees. They will convert the land into farmland or into meadow for grazing grazing animals. And that, of course, causes some other problems. Additionally, while it's not the biggest problem, the fact that the population increases so quickly in that region means that more and more buildings are needed to not only house people, but to house the businesses that are servicing that population. And wood, of course, is still one of the primary construction materials. Now, what does all that mean? Well, right off the bat, we know that as soon as we start clearing out the trees, if we clear out too many, the root systems for those trees, the stumps are pulled or they're artificially rotted out. As that root system disappears, the ground becomes much more susceptible to erosion. So while they may not get a lot of rainfall, you know from reading about monsoons and cyclones that when they do get rainfall, it generally comes with very, very high winds in very concentrated um, doses. And as such, the amount of rainfall that comes with those storms and the amount of wind that those storms produce actually causes the ground to erode fairly quickly. So the deforestation not only reduces the amount of forest that's available for the natural ecosystem, it also speeds up the loss of actual arable land. Now, the government is trying to incentivize the people to um, slow deforestation. There are many communities that receive funds from the central government if, when they cut down trees, they plant new trees in its place. And so it's not unusual to see that kind of arrangement, but it is not a big program. It doesn't happen everywhere in the region, and consequently, the forests are disappearing faster than they're being regenerated. I think this is last but not least, we'll talk about air pollution. As you might expect, where you have a lot of people, you also have a lot of vehicles. Um, There are some trains in India, but again, that's infrastructure that goes back to the British occupation. And so a lot of the mass transit um, options available for long distance travel are old and in poor repair. They do, of course, have local trains in the larger cities, and buses are much more evident in some of the major cities around the region than they are in more modernized parts of the world. But there are just uh, tens of millions of cars, and most of them are going to be in the urban areas. So the concentration of vehicles in any one place is particularly high. As a result, the exhaust from those vehicles creates a problem that we actually haven't seen in the United States for 40 years or more. It creates a very heavy smog, smoke mixed with fog, that you can see on the left there. Um, that's a city street in one of the major cities in South Asia. But you also have air pollution concerns in the rural areas because, again, the rural areas don't have electricity, they don't have natural gas, they don't have a lot of the modern conveniences. So, as they are um, heating their homes, cooking their food, processing their uh, uh, cottage industry wares for sale, they are burning wood. They are creating charcoal in order to use for smelting operations. So they burn the wood to make the charcoal, then they use the charcoal for heating metal. They're burning kerosene, which is, of course, an oil byproduct. Um, they will even burn gasoline, which is just as bad burning it for fuel as it is burning it in a car engine. They will also burn animal dung. That waste product, animal waste that we said could be used for fertilizer on the farmland. When it's really dried out, it can also be used as burnable fuel. In fact, that's something that goes back in North America prior to the Europeans showing up there. The burning of animal dung was actually quite common here as well. In Europe, burning of animal dung actually continued up through the 17 and 1800s. In the Indian subcontinent and South Asia, it is actually very, very common, particularly in the mountain regions where trees do not grow. So when you look at Nepal and Bhutan and some of the smaller countries along the Himalayan mountain range, you'll find that quite a few of them are using as their primary fuel dried animal dung. Now, the fact that these populations are burning all of this raw fuel, they all put a lot of smoke into the atmosphere. Of course, kerosene, gasoline, and a lot of the few factories that they do have putting out unfiltered factory smoke. All of that stuff puts all kinds of chemicals and nasty byproducts into the atmosphere. There's so much smoke and dust and ash coming out of South Asia that there has developed a permanent cloud of brown air over parts of the Indian Ocean. Now, if you remember where the Indian Ocean is, that's this area right here. This is Malaysia, and this is India. And the Indian Ocean starts right here and it actually extends. This is the Bay of Bengal. The Indian Ocean actually extends all the way down to Australia on this part of the subcontinent. So your prevailing winds blowing west to east have actually carried a lot of the burning smoke out of this part of South Asia and have carried it across the Bay of Bengal and down into the Indian Ocean. And as a result, the air is so brown over that part of the Indian Ocean that about 10% of total sunlight is actually blocked from reaching the planet's surface. And there are several scientists that are looking at this and trying to evaluate what the effect is. And there's actually several studies being done on the impact of this brown cloud of pollution on the ecosystem that exists in that part of the Indian Ocean. What happens when you block out 10% of the sun? So that is the last environmental concern that the book talks about. You will see that on my slides here, there are 2 videos. I will be posting those links in the classroom. The first one here on the water situation in South Asia, and the second one here on the issues with air pollution in South Asia. And I encourage you to go out to YouTube and take a look at both of those videos. And as always, if you have any questions at all, feel free to email me and I will be happy to explain it to you. We will be talking about the climate zones over the next couple of days. And if you picked up the hard copy paper product at the school gymnasium several weeks ago, you know that there is a worksheet for the India climate zone. But for the time being, we're going to deal with the rest of the physical geography and the environmental concerns. And I will be posting more about that in the classroom. So thank you very much. And I will talk to you again tomorrow.